Him in prayer, and he does indeed hear. Tonight, I don't know that we'll get through the entire 8th chapter, but we're going to shoot for it. But this is a lot to get into. And Judges, this is our 14th session. As my verse shows, verse 32 is towards the end of the text. Whether we actually get there or not, we'll see. It says, "And Gideon, the son of Joash, died in a good old age, and was buried in the sepulchre of Joash his father in Ophrah of the ezrites." Like I said, we're now into the 8th chapter with Gideon as our continued subject. And of course, as a reminder, Gideon is our 5th judge. And he will, of course, as he did already, in that 7-year span of the harvest being stolen and their fields stripped by the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the children of the east. If you remember, of course, he will do it with only 300 men, down from 32,000 against 135,000, so that they would know this victory was of the Lord and not man. I caution you always to remember, when you look at things that are insurmountable, the odds are totally against you. We were talking just about marriage. Listen, a lot of people will give up because the odds look like they're just insurmountable. You're never going to reconcile. They have a thing, irreconcilable differences. But I can tell you, go to the Lord, take it to the Lord, work from the Lord, let the Lord work on you. You'd be surprised what he can do. That can be the case of reconciliation with any broken relationship. God would use a man who was hiding from the enemy. He would use a man who fought with great doubts about his calling. God would use a man, we know him as Gideon, who had a fear, but used the means that God provided to encourage himself in the face of the fight. The battle plan was so strange, 300 against 135,000. But we're not talking about swords just yet. All we're talking about is the clay pitcher, a lamp, and a trumpet. Shine the light, say the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And this caused so much chaos that the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the children of the east proceeded to kill one another. 120,000 fell that day. And of course, now you've got 300 that are chasing the rest. Now you still need to understand, you've got 300 chasing 15,000. That ought to still mark it off as miraculous. Gideon sent messengers to Ephraim, if you remember, about cutting off their escape route at the Jordan River, and so that they would absolutely crush them, that they would never be able to return and take any of Israel's harvest again. It's a reminder that we fight against the flesh, our own flesh, and you cannot leave any of it alive. You need to mortify, therefore, the deeds of the flesh. We're talking spiritual now, but it's important that we understand that, and that none of it can be left alive, not the smallest part. The battle must be complete. And of course, that's exactly what happened when the Ephraimites began to fight, and they did, and they, of course, bring those 2 princes of Meridian, their heads, back to Gideon, and along with their heads, they brought a complaint. But we're going to be looking tonight at the conquest of Gideon. You remember chapter 6. I'm not going to go through all of these, but we broke it down. Chapter 7, same thing, subduing the Midianites. And we'll see, this is kind of a continued story of that part of it. And then chapter 8 tonight, we've got 3 parts: the conquest of Gideon, the snare of Gideon, and the death of Gideon. But they all kind of go together in what we're looking at here. As far as the conquest of Gideon, let's just go ahead and get started and looking at the fact that Gideon conquers. And he's got some battles. First of all, he conquers the complaints. What were the complaints? Verse 1, and the men of Ephraim said unto him, why hast thou served us thus, that thou callest us not when thou wentest to fight with the Midianites? And they did chide with him sharply. Well, it's interesting what they did. The complaint, why didn't you get a hold of us? Well, what is his answer? How does he answer them? Does he tell them about God's plan? About what God did? Oh, he said this. He said unto them, what have I done now in comparison of you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? In other words, what you've accomplished is so much greater than what I have accomplished. What have I done in comparison to you? Look what he says. God hath delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, who are Oreb and Zeb, if you remember, they're the kings. And what was I able to do in comparison of you? Then their anger was abated toward him when he said that. Again, no sooner did the peak of the battle end and trouble started. And we have to be reminded of that oftentimes, that we may be in a pitched battle, and as it subsides at the peak of it, afterwards we still may have to deal with some complaints or some contest to our spirituality. The whole thing here is, why didn't you call us into the fight? Why weren't they called to be part of this miraculous battle? Again, why didn't he tell them? Because God didn't want you there. That would have been the easiest answer, because God wanted to whittle us down to 300. In fact, if you look, he doesn't even ask Ephraim to join with them going after the 15,000. He just asked them to stop them there at the Jordan River. Gideon could have told the whole story of the thinning of the ranks, and he could have told them about the strange battle plan. But instead, he spoke to them about their accomplishments and how God honored them even above what Gideon had done. It's like he said, all we did was stand there, break clay pitchers, and shout. You killed most of them yourselves. You, on the other hand, took princes. We may have started to fight, but you have finished the fight. John Gill put it best when he said in Gideon's terms, he says, the glory of the conquest is yours. That's what he was saying to Ephraim. And with that, their loud voices and their overheated faces started to calm, and they were appeased. You know, a lot of times if we think about, again, how to appease, how to calm others that are upset. They had no reason to be upset. They should have been calm in all this. It was God's plan that Gideon was implementing. They should have known that. It was God who raised them up. But nonetheless, they were angry, but they were eventually appeased. Then with that, Gideon travels over the Jordan, verse 4. And there's now a conquest over hunger. He's got to fight this because their men have done all these things. And you're going to find out as we read through this, they did all this within 48 hours. It's possible they did it within 28 to 36 hours. 24 to 36 hours. Again, what they did, it's a great lesson for us. So if you notice the words I have highlighted in dark there in bold, and Gideon came to Jordan and passed over, he and 300 men that were with him, faint, yet pursuing. When I say there was a conquest of Gideon over hunger, a lot of us, man, we can't wait to get home to eat Sunday afternoon because we're starving to death. Right? We'll talk about that. I'm just starving to death. I've got to have something to eat. I got to have it now. Here's these men in a fight. What is it? It says they were faint, yet pursuing. They were chasing them. This wasn't a casual walk in the woods. They were tracking them and then taking them out, and they were not allowing any to escape. They were faithful and they were persistent. They were determined and they were overcomers. Sound like anybody we ought to know? We are overcomers. The New Testament believer today is an overcomer by faith. we have overcome the world. We have overcome the flesh. We have overcome the devil through Jesus Christ. And whether or not we are faint, we ought to never give up. Faint, yet pursuing. They were worn out and they needed energy and they needed to eat. They knew this was asking a lot because of the previous 7 years. Remember, don't take this out of context. These Midianites were stealing every bit of food that they had. So they didn't have a lot of stockpiles. So when Gideon and his men were asking for food for 300, they're like, I don't think so. Let's look at what they said, because they had none to share. But Gideon explains the situation to the men of Succoth, and that's what we're looking at, verse 5 and further on. He said unto the men of Succoth, give, I pray you, loaves of bread unto the people that follow me. Notice he's not asking even for himself. He's asking for his men. For they be faint, and I am pursuing after Zebah and Zalmunna, kings of Midian. Gideon was humble in his request. Notice what he says. And he said unto the men of Succoth, give, I pray you. Not I command you. Not I demand. That's the same as begging. It's the same as Paul saying, I beseech ye therefore. It is a pleading of men. I pray you, I beg you for the benefits of others and for the noble cause. These kings of Midian, again, had 15,000 men, and they're running from 300. And Gideon isn't even asking them or demanding that they join them in the fight and rid their land of these thieves once and for all. He just wanted a little food for a small, brave army. What happens? Verse 6, the princes of Succoth said, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in thine hand? Are they under arrest? Do you have them tied up? Are they with you that we should give bread unto thine army? The idea is, too, if we give you bread, unless you've got them under control, they come every year. And if they come next year and we have helped you out, they're going to wipe us out. It'll cost us dearly. Notice what he says in verse 7. And Gideon said, therefore, when the Lord hath delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, then will I tear your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. Now that's pretty strong. It's even going to be stronger a little bit later when we talk about some other brethren, Penuel, that's here. But this is a promise from God to Gideon about the victory. He will overcome these Midianites' king. And when he does and captures them and deals with them, he's telling them, I will be back to deal with you. So what does he do? Remember, faint, hungry, yet pursuing. He moves on. And he went up thence to Penuel, and spake unto them likewise. And the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Succoth had answered him. And he spake also unto the men of Penuel, saying, when I come again in peace, I will break down this tower. So apparently there was a piece of security. They're fencing their walls that were there, and they had a tower that gave them that group, and probably they're speaking down to Gideon. It's possible that they didn't even open the gates to him, that they weren't friendly. But what happens is neither one of these groups respected Gideon and the need that they had for food, and they would not provide for Gideon's men to be refreshed. So Gideon and his men leave, and they go to a place called Karkor. Now Zebah, and this is again another conquest, over, and it says particle is supposed to be partial. I didn't spell that one very good over particle board. No, partial obedience is what that's supposed to say. Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor, and their hosts with them, about 15,000 men, and all that were left of all the host of the children of the east, for there fell 120,000 men that drew swords. So again, that's why I was telling you, Gideon is chasing these kings, and he's found them along with the 15,000. But that doesn't deter Gideon at all. Why should it? He saw the miraculous battle. he fought against an even larger number, and they won. They didn't really have to do much. They watched more than anything else. And these guys ran. We do not see anything further about pitchers, lamps, or horns to blow and words to cheer. But we read in verse 11, and Gideon went up by the way of them that dwelt in tents on the east of Nobah and Jogbehah, and smote the host, for the host was secure. And what he did was he came through an indirect route. In other words, when this is telling you how that he went, he didn't come by the main roads or the main streets. He was going by the way that the nomads would travel with their flocks. It was just really a small band of men, 300, not as obvious, and they had a surprise attack. And all we read about the details is just what you said, or just what we read. And they smote the host. That's it. No more details other than that. So we can't tell you anything else. But we do know this. Again, here we have a weary group of men. They're weary, faint, yet pursuing, and now they have succeeded. And verse 12, and when Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued after them and took the 2 kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and discomforted all the host. So Gideon has now captured the 2 kings. They're what we would call handcuffed, probably roped and put in tow. Maybe they were allowed to ride on their decorated camels, who knows. All this, though, was done in very quick order. How do we know that? Look at verse 13. And Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from battle before the sun was up. Gideon had a conquest over procrastination. He didn't wait. He didn't hesitate. He was all on fire, and he was following after the Lord, and he was following fully after the Lord. And what happens is they are doing all of this. In verse 14, we realize that he catches a young man. There's some conquest over unfinished business. What's the unfinished business? He's got to go back and take care of those 2 towns that would not help them. So he caught a young man of the men of Succoth, and inquired of him, and he described unto him the princes of Succoth, and the elders thereof, even 70 men. So we're imagining that this man is probably fearful, especially if he had any knowledge of what had previously transpired, and about the promise of Gideon. And of course, Gideon's 300 men towing the 2 kings of Midian along with them, and he's asking them about the elders, and they tell him about the 77 men. Many will say basically what Gideon was doing was he was getting the names and addresses. These were the men who said no. They were in charge. No, we're not going to give you any bread. And so what does he do? Verse 15, and he came unto the men of Succoth and said, Behold, Zebah and Zalmunna. It's kind of like, would you notice who I brought back with me? You guys asked and made comment about these 2 men, with whom you did, he says, upbraid me, saying, Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in thy hand, that we should give bread unto thy men that are weary? Yes, I have them now. They are in tow. What did he do? He took the elders of the city and the thorns of wilderness and briars, and with them he taught the men of Succoth. Now, what kind of teaching do you think that was? Yeah, some of you that are older might remember getting a switch. And we're not talking about a light switch. Talking about, for me, I can remember a peach tree limb. That was my big thing, was remember there was always a limb up in the windowsill. That little thing would sting your legs like no get out. Now, can you imagine men as an adult? And I would imagine that Gideon's men were out gathering the briars and the thorns and thistles from the wilderness. And they bring them into town, and they say, where are they? And they went and picked them up, and they taught the men. How do you think? He whipped them. That's what he did. It sounds like a complete thrashing. He literally broke their flesh with these thorns and briars. And this is all that he promised those 77 elders of the city, and it seems like he did it in public. Now, I say it gets worse because of the city of Penuel. What did he promise them? He said this tower will fall when I get back. He didn't say that he would kill the men of the city, but he said he would tear down the tower. Well, these men, maybe they put up a fight. We don't know what happened here completely. They got in the way, and they died. That's very serious. They did not survive this. We don't know the details of how this was accomplished, but it was done, and it was a scourging that this town would never forget. Gideon then turns his full attention to the two kings of Midian. In verse 18 it says, then he said unto Zebah and Zalmunna, what manner of men were they whom ye slew at Tabor? And they answered, as thou art, so were they. Each one resembled the children of a king. It's really a very personal question that Gideon is finding out, who was it that you killed? And he's zeroing in on the fact that this is probably, most say, was his mother's side of the family. And that they were actually killing his extended family. And that's what was happening to them. So Gideon, this causes Gideon to bring the judgment of, remember, because that's what Gideon is. He's a judge. And he issues a judgment against them of capital punishment upon both these men. And what does he say? Verse 19, and he said, they were my brethren, even the sons of my mother. As the Lord liveth, if ye had saved them alive, I would not slay you. So they know what's coming. So what does he do? He turns to his firstborn, his youngest son. And he said unto Jether, his firstborn, up and slay him. Uh-oh. But the youth drew not his sword, for he feared, because he was yet a youth. Now you can make of that what you want, but this young man had never taken a life. He'd never been in a battle, and he was afraid. They knew that they were still going to die, but this was a little bit of a glitch in the program. So they spoke up real quick. In fact, they were a little shocked at all of what happened. So verse 21, they thought it was beneath them to be killed by such a young man. So Zebah and Zalmunna said, rise thou, they're talking to Gideon, and fall upon us. For as the man is, so is his strength. In other words, we should be honored by being killed by the highest man in your army. That's what they're asking about. So Gideon arose and slew Zebah and Zalmunna and took away the ornaments that were on their camels' necks. Now that's an important little notation. You'll get a little bit more about that. But they really did want to be killed by the hand of Gideon. The next section goes from verse 22 to 28. And this is what I call the snare of Gideon. But it begins, first of all, with the monarchy being refused. Now, if you will notice, Gideon slew them, those kings. He took the ornaments off of their camels. I don't know why. Did he do it as a trophy? Was this just simply a reminder of God's grace and his, victory, a token of these things? But he did something else with these ornaments and with others that had been captured that should never have been done. Gideon seemed, and let me put emphasis on that, Gideon seemed very popular. At least it seems like that, because they wanted him and his family to rule over them. So they're offering him a monarchy. It's not been formulated like in the times of Samuel, where Israel rejects the judges and they want a king to rule over them. But this is kind of the beginning of it. So here's what happens in verse 22. The monarchy refused. Then the men of Israel said unto Gideon, rule thou over us, both thou and thy son and thy son's son also. So you can see what they're talking about, a generational ruling. So they're looking for a monarchy, for thou hast delivered us from the hand of Midian. And Gideon said unto them, I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. This is a theocracy. This is not a monarchy. You need to allow God to raise up the judges. He knew that he had been raised up. He knew that God had raised up those before him, and he knew that God would raise them up after him. You need to depend upon the Lord. Verse 24, Gideon said to them, I would desire a request of you, that you would give me every man the earrings of his prey. Well, here's where I say the mistake made. For they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. Apparently you could identify them by their earrings. And they answered, the men did, we will willingly give them. And they spread a garment and did cast therein every man the earrings of his prey. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides ornaments and collars and purple raiment that was on the kings of Midian, and beside the chains that were about their camels' necks. There was probably more gold on the camels' necks than most of the Jews even knew what to do with. But they did this. And here's the mistake in its fruition. He makes an ephod. In chapter 8, verse 27, and Gideon made an ephod thereof, and put it in his city, even in Ophrah. And all Israel went thither, a whoring after it, which thing became a snare unto Gideon and to his house. People are more interested a lot of times in icons. Something that reminds them of something that happened religious. In fact, you've got a whole world today that's more interested in icons than they are in the Word of God. They're more desirous of having a splinter of the cross, having a thread from someone's clothes, having a piece of hair from someone's head. But I'll tell you, here what we see, no matter what his intentions were, good intentions do not always result in the way it may have been planned. I mean, it must have been a spectacular piece of work, and it was being displayed in some sort of fashion to memorialize the victory over the Midianites through the miracle. It became a problem first for Israel. People were drawn to this thing, and that finally had some sort of an effect upon Gideon. Gideon became someone to look at, someone to observe. There he is. There's this is, and this story's being told, and it's being blown up. But what's happening? It's about Gideon, not about the Lord. So it became a snare to both him and to his house. Maybe it was bringing them some sort of financial gain. Maybe there was some sort of prosperity. But let's look at the rest of this and see if we can kind of get to it, and kind of then we see just the last part of this, Midian subdued. Thus, Midian was subdued. That's it. Thus was Midian subdued before the children of Israel, so that they lifted up their heads no more. In other words, the Midianites never came back. That was it. They were done. They never attacked. And that's the way they were supposed to be. And the country was in quietness 40 years in the days of Gideon. Gideon so wiped them out that these Midianites had no more strength, no more confidence to even fight. That's why it says they lifted their heads no more. They walked in shame. The summary of this event, of all that we see, is the country was in quietness. No battles, no wars, no more stolen harvests, no more famine. Then we read in the last part of this, the death of Gideon and Gideon's rest. Gideon had subdued the land. He brought peace and justice and honoring Jehovah, making sure that God was first in their lives. So we see it in verse 29, and Jerubbaal the son of Joash went and dwelt in his own house. He had rest. Now what happened though? It's important to the story that we get this little kind of addendum in the next few verses. We're going to see this in verse 30. And Gideon had 70 sons. We've already mentioned this at the beginning, that they had 70 sons of his body, for he had many wives. That again we don't often hear or think about. Verse 31, and his concubine. She's mentioned on purpose because of the son. And his concubine that was in Shechem, she also bare him a son, whose name he called Abimelech. Now, you're going to find out he's not a great guy, not a good guy, but this is the guy that's going to claim to be the next judge. And we know that Israel had some bad judges. And what happens then? Gideon, the son of Joash, died in a good old age and was buried in the sepulchre of Joash his father in Ophrah of the ezrites. But verse 33 is disturbing. And Jehovah's rejection. And it came to pass, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel turned again and went a whoring after Balaam and made Baal-berith their god. This is the part that to me is the saddest of the story. Again, the beginning of the cycle is the end of the judge's life. What happened is you see how quickly they turned. And the next few verses, reveal that the people did not appreciate Gideon, and they did not show kindness to him or to his family after he died. How quickly did they turn to idolatry? It seems they turned real quickly. And so that must mean that their worship of Jehovah during that 40 years had something missing. I would dare say that what was missing was the heart. When the heart's not in it, it's easy to turn against the Lord and turn away from the Lord. They didn't just turn, though. Notice what it says, that the children of Israel turned again and went a whoring after Balaam, and they made Baal-berith their god. They literally made a covenant with this false god. They were replacing Jehovah with Baal-berith. Their moorings were not sure. Their anchor is not set and set fast. So their false doctrine is being taught. They're eating it up. Their ears are being turned. And it may have been that even their eyes were turned by the spectacle of idolatry. And the children of Israel, how sad is this? Israel's forgetfulness. How does this happen, that the children of Israel remembered not the Lord their God, who had delivered them out of the hands of all their enemies on every side? Now, I heard the story of Gideon when I was a child. I heard the story of Daniel in the lion's den. I heard the story of the 3 Hebrew children thrown into the fiery furnace. I've never once forgotten any of those stories. I don't know how you possibly could forget the miraculous story of Gideon and the sword of the Lord. Even if you mess it up a little bit, you're still going to remember it was only 300 against 135. And the Lord turned it on them that they ended up killing themselves. How could they forget the manner and the means by which God had delivered them? It took 40 years, but they did forget. It is possible that people can forget how that they were saved. They can become so cold, so indifferent, and their conscience so seared. They forgot God, and they also forgot anything about Gideon and his family. That's why we read here in verse 35, Israel's negligence. Neither showed they kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, namely Gideon, according to all the goodness which he had showed Israel. They did not reciprocate with the kindness that Gideon showed them. What a shame this is. The fact that this happened must be called out. But they turned their backs on God first. But it seems like they never had a real love for Gideon in the first place. It sounds like they served God or behaved themselves and acted right because Gideon might have been likely to go beat them with the thorns of wilderness and the briars. I think he was a tough judge. I think he was a rough judge, and they knew what he did, and they were planning to stay on the straight and narrow as long as he was alive. But once he's dead, they left. Let me give you a few things, simple applications, because I'm past time, but I did get through with it. And I'll give you some things here. Number one, I think in all of this story, we have to learn to focus on the spiritual. Always. Don't focus on the physical. Don't look at the outnumbering. It doesn't matter how big the army is. It doesn't matter how big the problem is. God can solve your problem and deliver you from anything and everything. Number two, learn how to rehearse and build verbal memorials in your family. You ought to always listen. We do this on Wednesday nights, and we're not very good at it. You all need to learn how to build verbal memorials on Wednesday nights and remind yourselves of what God has done for you. It is a shame that we're quiet and don't say a word of thank you and hallelujah for the little things. We need to build verbal memorials. Man is too forgetful, and there is no promise to the next generation that they will pick up where we left off. We need to keep on reminding these young ones of how great our God is. And you need to do the same thing. My wife would always talk to us in our family vacations of building memories. We did things to build memories in our family. We need to build verbal memorials. And by that, I will say you need to be very cautious, and I'll make it this way: avoid physical memorials. Why is that? Because physical memorials can become idolatry. Be careful what you have. Hey, that was because of our, we've got pictures and we've got all kinds of stuff. But, there's things that I even used to grab rocks sometimes where we went. A rock, I got a lot of rocks in my yard. And I can remember where some of these rocks came from. But it's just a rock. Well, but it's still a rock. It's a physical, sometimes memorial. And it can become something that they were never intended to become. So be very careful. Number 4, be prepared to support God's man and God's men if they are in the business of pursuing. We need to be serious enough that when we see a preacher come our way, if they need to be encouraged, then we ought to do so. Lastly, be prepared to be forgotten. There are forgotten Baptists. John Gilpin, Buell Kazee, Jesse Mercer, A.C. Dayton, J.M. Pendleton, J.R. Graves. I could give you a host of others. I can remember sitting around at a conference and listening to young men talk about an old preacher that had just been up in the pulpit and preached. After lunch, they were talking about how they didn't really enjoy him. He needs to go sit down. He's past his prime. And I got so mad, I walked up to those boys and I kept my cool as much as I could, but I said, you do not realize what that war horse has been through. That man has done more to serve the Lord and fought more battles than you will ever consider battling. You need to make sure and honor him with what he has gone through in his life. Do you realize that there are preachers that were fantastic ministers, great men of the Word of God, and yet they have even children, or especially grandchildren or great-grandchildren, who have never heard nor read a sermon of theirs. They are not members of a church, and they don't even attend a church. How sad is that? Be prepared to be forgotten, because you will be forgotten. Gideon was forgotten, and they showed him no kindness. I know I went long tonight, but I wanted to get through that entire 8th chapter, and we did tonight. And Lord bless you for putting up with me on that one. Appreciate it a great deal. I pray that's been a blessing. We'll be in chapter 9 next week and begin to look at